welcome to this live stream. I'm delighted tonight to be joined by Dr. George Beccolini. Beccolini, I hope I said that right.
Beccoloni.
Beccoloni. Yes, you told me in the beginning. I've forgotten already. So how are you doing?
Yeah, fine, thanks.
It's great to hear from you. And just before we get into your introduction, you're giving me your valuable time just before you set off to, I believe it's the Far East.
Yep, for Indonesia. I'm going to spend a month in Indonesia doing 2 Wallace-related cruises. But on the 5th of October, I and other people have arranged for a big sort of ceremony in the village where Wallace actually discovered natural selection, and I'm going to unveil a monument to him. So I've actually got a map here. The red bit shows where the island is. It's on the island of Halmahera in the middle of Indonesia.
Right.
So you can see Singapore there, and then Borneo to the east of it, and then Sulawesi Island, and then Halmahera Island between Sulawesi and New Guinea Island. Anyway, that's where Wallace was in February 1858 when he discovered natural selection in a feverish delirium. He probably had malaria. So yeah, many people would have you believe, the sort of Darwin fanboys of this world, that it was a lucky accident and it just came from out of nowhere. But in fact, Wallace had been actively studying evolution and writing a series of papers about it for the past 10 years. So I thought, because Wallace isn't very well known at all to anyone, even biologists these days, although he was probably the most famous person, or at least scientist, in the world when he died in 1913. And all the world's papers from Bombay to Boston had full-page articles about, the great Wallace, who's just passed away, the last of the great Victorians. But after his death, he was basically eclipsed by Darwin for various reasons. And yeah, he is now certainly not a household name, whereas Darwin is a household name.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, because Wallace has been forgotten about, the early history of evolutionary biology has been rewritten by people who basically adore Darwin as some sort of secular god, and Wallace has been written out of the story. But there's a lot to Wallace. He's a fascinating individual, and he did a lot more than just, simply discovering natural selection. He actually had, as I might explain, a more modern view of evolution, adaptive evolutionary change, than Darwin did. Darwin's theory was actually flawed, but Wallace's was the modern theory.
Yeah.
So can I just sort of quickly go through Wallace's life?
Yeah, just before that, I wanted to actually introduce you formally to the audience.
Sorry.
So there's a lot to Wallace, but there's a lot to you as well. I was really impressed with your history. So you've actually crossed over a few fields. You're not only an evolutionary biologist, you're also a science historian. You're also the director of the Wallace Correspondence Project, who worked at the London Natural History Museum, which I have to say is one of the best, if not the best in the world, for a number of years. And amongst all those things, there's I can see a lot more there. Did I miss out any? Actually, I'll let you complete what else you've been up to.
Well, 2 of my specialities are butterflies, which I did my PhD thesis on. Tropical butterflies, and cockroaches.
Yes.
So I'm one of the few people in the world who seriously studies non-pest cockroaches, and they're a very fascinating group. But they're sort of a bit like Wallace. People don't like them and don't know very much about them.
Yeah. I think that's a good way of putting it. So before we get into Wallace and his history and why his formulation of natural selection as a theory was better than Darwin's. Let's take a few steps back. If I was to ask you, George, if I pick up a book from the early 20th century, it's likely to say Wallace and Darwin's theory, right? And
Hmm.
this is quite interesting. So if I go down to one of those antique bookshops in central London and I was to pick up a Victorian book, it's pretty clear you will find Darwin and Wallace, Darwin and Wallace. In fact, I was reading a book by the philosopher David Stove, an Australian philosopher of science, and he referred to it even in the 90s, which is not too long ago, as Darwin and Wallace's theory. But he was, somebody from a different era. But you just do not even see the reference to Darwin and Wallace together. Now a lot of the discussions about Wallace are either he's sidelined completely or he's mentioned in passing, right? So to begin off with, why was there a shift from the Victorian era to the modern synthesis and so on, in which Wallace was, just deleted from history?
Okay, well, it's a little bit complicated, but this is what I think is the reality, and other people agree with me in whole or in part. So, after Darwin's death in 1882, the theory of natural selection as the explanation for evolution dropped out of fashion. And that period was called by historians the eclipse of Darwinism. And other scientists came up with all kinds of other hypotheses to propose how evolution worked. There was one, for instance, which is affectionately known as the hopeful monster theory,
Yeah.
which says that new species can arise in a single jump, that the offspring of a mother might be so different to her that they couldn't interbreed with her original species, and that they would then have to interbreed with the other offspring, and they would form a separate species. That, as far as I know, doesn't happen in animals, although it does happen in plants. Primula cuensis, for instance, is formed when was formed when there was sort of a duplication of chromosomes in the seed, and the seeds that sprouted couldn't interbreed with the parent stock. But anyway, that was Goldschmidt's theory, but there were various other theories as well. And then basically Wallace died in 1913, then the First World War happened.
Yeah.
And by the time that modern genetics had started to develop, and population genetics, which was used to model gene flow and evolution, that was in the sort of late 30s, early 40s. By that stage, there'd been decades, from Wallace's death till then, and people had just simply forgotten about Wallace, and they looked in the literature and saw this huge green book, Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, and many people, because biologists quite famously are generally pretty ignorant of the history of their subject and don't delve deep into it. A lot
Yes.
of people just assumed it was Darwin's theory, and then books started to be written about Darwin. Now there are literally hundreds of biographies, and they tend to recycle information over and over and over again. And the population just came to believe, oh well, Darwin's theory. Some of them don't mention Wallace at all, and most of them, if probably basically all of them, don't go into the story. They don't dare say things like, actually, Wallace's theory was superior to Darwin's, because basically it wouldn't be a book about Darwin anymore, because, what's the interest in Darwin if he had a flawed theory? But so, yeah, the biographies just tend to mention Wallace in passing and often dishonestly, like one day Darwin got this unexpected letter from the Far East containing a paper by this young unknown person called Wallace, and it was similar to his own, whereas actually it was identical to his own, because I've checked. And then it forced him to publish his own theory, and then it talks about Darwin's theory, and then he published it in Origin of Species, and it was Darwin, Darwin, Darwin after that. So
Mm. So, this is interesting. What do you think is the significant difference between the two theories of natural selection? Because obviously there is a difference between the two of them. You said that Wallace had a more correct theory to Darwin.
yeah, well, it's basically it's not natural selection. It's the theory of adaptive evolutionary change. So natural selection was jointly published by Darwin and Wallace. Of course, most of these biographies don't tell you that either. So it's a jointly published theory, published in August 1858. And I'd like to, after this, explain how that came to be. But this is the title page of the theory. So you can see on the tendency of species to form varieties, etc., by Charles Darwin, Esquire, FRS, FLS, FGS, and Alfred Russel Wallace, Esquire. No initials and things after his name. So this paper contained both Darwin and Wallace's versions of natural selection, and as the mechanism for adaptive evolutionary change, and they are identical. I've gone through both men's versions of it, and obviously they're not worded the same, because if they were, then it would be plagiarism. But all the elements of the theory. So this chart actually explains the theory, all the steps that have to exist before you get natural selection.
Yep.
So people can look back at this frame later if they want to read through them. But all of these stages are in Darwin and Wallace's separate papers. But the difference is not in the paper, but in Darwin's Origin of Species, and also in his former big book on evolution, etc., his earlier writings. And that is that Darwin, well, firstly, I'll explain Wallace, in his paper, in his part of this paper that I just showed you, he explicitly dismissed Lamarckism, the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So things acquired during the life of a parent. They used to believe, for instance, that a blacksmith using, his right arm to beat metal would develop huge biceps, and that these biceps could be inherited by his son, etc. But that theory was long ago proven to be wrong definitively by Weismann, who, by the way, Weismann, the German evolutionary biologist, and Wallace were the only two well-known people who maintained the primacy of natural selection during the eclipse of Darwinism after Darwin's death.
Yeah.
Anyway, in Origin of Species, what most people won't tell you is that chapter 5 is totally devoted to what Darwin called use and disuse inheritance. And basically, Darwin had believed in Lamarckism and believed that it operated alongside natural selection. So
sorry, could I just ask you a question before you move on? Now, you said that Darwin believed in some use and disuse and inheritance of traits. And in a debate between Richard Dawkins and Dennis Noble, this issue came up of whether Darwin was a Lamarckian. And Dennis Noble said in the 6th edition that he had his theory of gemmules, and this has now been shown. And Dawkins was pushing back that actually no, he was just flirting with these ideas. He wasn't really Lamarckian. So this is something very confusing for a lot of people, because they would say Lamarck, his ideas were totally discredited. Darwin, we have a new fresh paradigm, and they move on. And the idea that Darwin was a Lamarckian, and the same sort of thing that you were just saying a minute ago, would get a pushback from people. What would you say to that to get people convinced that actually Darwin was open to Lamarckian ideas?
Okay, well, firstly, go and read chapter 5 of Origin of Species and see what Darwin actually said. Secondly, Dawkins is wrong if he said what you just said, because he hadn't developed his theory of pangenesis yet. The theory of pangenesis was a Lamarckian theory, which he developed later on in his book about domestication of animals. And it actually gave a mechanism to explain his use and disuse inheritance. So in the first edition of Origin, he had this chapter. He was convinced that Lamarckism actually was part of adaptive evolutionary change. Later on, he developed an actual mechanism which said that basically various little gemmules, microscopic gemmules, were given off by all the cells of the body, and they contained information about the body part they're coming from, and they migrated down to the sex organs and then were transmitted to the offspring.
Yeah.
Wallace flirted with the idea when Darwin first proposed it for a little while, and then realized that it was false. And then Wallace, for many years, implored other scientists like Francis Galton, etc., to test these ideas. And in fact, people tested them. Like one experiment was to cut off the tails of rats or mice and see whether the tailless offspring would result. Over many generations, the tails were chopped. And of course, they didn't. And then there was, I think Galton did blood transfusions with rabbits, different breeds of rabbits, to see if the offspring of those rabbits which had the blood transfusion could pass on the traits of the ones that where the blood was from, and they found that it didn't. So eventually people later on in the 19th century accepted Weismann's germplasm hypothesis, that the reproductive cells are isolated from the rest of the body cells, and information doesn't pass from body cells to the reproductive cells. And so
just to clarify, the Weismann barrier was not something which Darwin proposed. It was something that came off Darwin.
It was by Weismann. Darwin, until the end of his life, into the 6th edition of Origin, believed in use and disuse inheritance. He never rejected it. And Wallace, there's letters from Wallace and between Wallace and Darwin about it. Wallace was vehemently opposed to it and believed only in natural selection. So, strangely enough, Wallace, as I said, ditched Lamarckism from the start, from his 1858 essay, which was published together with Darwin. And ironically, one of the definitions of whatever it's called, neo-Darwinism is natural selection minus Lamarckism. And so, ironically, Wallace was the first neo-Darwinian, right from the start.
That's interesting. I remember coming across a book which was just titled Darwinism, and Wallace was the author.
Yeah, he always highly admired Darwin. And
would you say, George, that Wallace's humbleness and his constant appreciation for Darwin as his senior in age is probably one of the reasons why he was left in Darwin's shadow?
Well, that's isn't true for the 19th century.
Okay.
It might be true, people reading back through things and seeing his book Darwinism, later on. But certainly in the 19th century, both men were honored. It was often called the Darwin-Wallace theory. And the ironic fact of the matter is that Wallace received 5 medals for to honor his joint discovery of evolution by natural selection. Whereas guess how many medals Darwin received for his part in the theory?
I'm not sure.
0.
0. Okay.
Yep. Basically, it started off as a political matter because after Origin of Species obviously kicked up a big fuss. And for the first approximately, I don't know, 10 years, say, none of the sort of prestigious scientific societies wanted to actually give Darwin the credit for the book. And the Royal Society awarded Darwin their, I think, their highest honor, which is the Copley Medal or something, for his other work on things like geology, etc. But specifically, they excluded any credit for Origin of Species. They said it's on my website. I've got the original documents, because it was a political hot potato. So they had a meeting and decided they would award this very high honor to Darwin, but excluding his work on, speciation, species, and the origin. And then when everything quietened down after about, say, 10 years, and people began to accept the idea of natural selection, because the Royal Society had already given Darwin their highest honor, and it didn't include that, no one else wanted to give Darwin a medal, so they all just gave Wallace medals. So Wallace got 5 medals for natural selection. And poor old Darwin, I don't know what Darwin thought of the whole thing. It's not recorded in his letters or anything.
Yeah,
Oh damn, that Wallace has got yet another medal for our joint idea.
yeah. I mean, I remember many years ago when I was first reading on this issue, the narrative was exactly what you just said. And I just accepted it, which is Darwin out of the blue got this letter from this young man who had discovered something similar to him in terms of natural selection, and Darwin, being the gentleman, wanted to present it together. Very simplistic, with downplaying, Wallace. But some of the things that you're saying are just not known. They're just really not known. And it's really kind of strange that if you look at the Wallace Correspondence Project, and if you look at the Darwin Correspondence Project, the amount of information that we have on both of these individuals now, and the way that we can cross-check their contributions, there's no reason for why Wallace, being sidelined in the way that he actually is.
Yeah. Well, actually, there is literature out there. It's just that it's swamped by all the Darwin literature. So if you read Jim Costa, who is another expert on Wallace, and he's an evolutionary biologist and works in South Carolina. And he's just written a book very recently called Radical by Nature, a biography of Alfred Russel Wallace, which has become a bestseller. And all of the stuff that I'm saying now is actually in his book. I've done more work on Wallace, Wallace and natural selection specifically, than any of these other people. And I'm gradually writing my own book about it, because there's a huge amount of detail that is unknown to even the likes of Jim Costa. It's a very fascinating story indeed. But yeah, I'm not sure when the book will be ready, because I'm doing another 2 books as well. So including volume 1 of the Correspondence of Alfred Russel Wallace, because I'm director of the Wallace Correspondence Project, and yeah, we're almost ready to start work on the first of the volumes.
Brilliant. And that's a live stream that I think we should do separately, George, just on the Wallace Correspondence Project, because I think something like that really needs to be highlighted. So one of the things I also wanted to ask was, you're getting involved in something quite prestigious at the moment with the unveiling of the plaque in terms of Indonesia. So someone can say, well, this is happening a bit too late, as in this should have happened decades ago, or why now? And I haven't heard any, media noise about this. It's only your email that I saw, and I realized, oh wow, this ceremony is taking place, and it's quite a big event. But I haven't seen any coverage anywhere. Very strange.
Yeah.
So give us a bit of a background to that, because that is very strange.
Well, I found that the media generally avoids Wallace because they think, oh, he's an unknown. So if there's anything new about Darwin, like new letter of Darwin found, you know, new letters from Wallace are 10 a penny, but new letter of Darwin found, or bank check signed by Wallace, sorry, Darwin, discovered. I mean, there was a big media thing about that. Anything about Darwin is sort of instant news.
Mhm.
The journalists lap it up, but I guess they think that Wallace just doesn't have the recognition, so people aren't going to take an interest.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's a difficult one. Also, I think some of the journalists, one problem is many of the journalists aren't science journalists; they're just general journalists. And
Mhm.
when they see a press release that I might put out, which says something like, Darwin's
Rival.
rival, whatever, they think this guy, is having a laugh. You know, there was no one who was rivaling the great, Charles Darwin, because the story just isn't known
Could we?
outside specialist circles. So they
Yeah.
don't tend to take me seriously. I think that's one problem.
Yeah. So I think that's definitely it. I mean, when I looked at the press release, obviously it's something which you can see straight away they're going to be put off by. But could we also say that when it comes to the formulation of the modern synthesis decades later, Wallace's influence on the modern synthesis may have been greater than that of Darwin?
Well, in terms of the fact that the modern synthesis didn't have Lamarckism in it,
Yeah,
then yes.
what I yeah, that's exactly what I meant. That when it came to um, Darwin's not doubts, but um, Darwin's lack of belief that natural selection can account for some things, so therefore Lamarckism or other things may be considered, and Wallace was more along the lines of being very singular about natural selection, and he maintained that. And like you said, and there's an excellent book by Peter Bowler on the eclipse of Darwinism, and you're right that Wallace was adamant on natural selection and its efficacy for decades. And the modern synthesis was very linear, is very singular, that natural selection working on random mutations can account for biodiversity. And there's definitely the isolation of the genome from gemmules or whatever else it is. So that's what I meant, that Wallace could be seen as a greater influence on the modern synthesis than Darwin himself.
Yeah, well, when you put it that way, then yes, but also there's many other aspects. For instance, Darwin's theory of sexual selection, which he was the only other theory that was proposed in the original 1858 paper. That has largely been shown to be wrong in favor of Wallace's version of sexual selection, which is basically natural selection, uh, females choosing the fittest males, not just beauty for beauty's sake, which was the whole um, kernel of Darwin's theory. Wallace said he couldn't imagine how a butterfly or a beetle could have an appreciation of beauty, and that's what Darwin believed, that the females were thinking, wow, that's a really pretty male, I want to mate with it. Whereas Wallace said, no, all of these characteristics of the males are linked to other aspects of fitness. So, for instance, I mean, he didn't use this example, but the peacock's tail,
Yeah, yeah,
it's huge and it encumbers the male peacock, so it's in more danger from being caught by tigers, etc. But the fittest peacocks can have longer tails because, in spite of their handicap, they're able to escape from predators. And in fact, often people regard this as it's called Zahavi's handicap hypothesis, but it was actually yet another of the ideas that Wallace came up with,
yeah,
as shown by Jim Costa.
yeah.
Um, and also modes of speciation. So one thing that a lot of people don't know or are confused by is what actually is natural selection. Well, natural selection is the mechanism by which one species or population that makes up a species changes through time. It doesn't say anything about speciation, at least in the way that we recognize it, but actually in the way that paleontologists recognize speciation, it does lead to that, called chronospecies. So one, say you start off with a shelled mollusk,
Yeah.
and then millions and millions of years later, there's just one lineage from this shelled mollusk. It's all the same species, but it gradually evolves to become an octopus. So through time, if you look at the fossils in the geological record, you'll see, you know, different looking things through time, and paleontologists would name those as separate species. But they, in fact, if they had the evidence, would recognize that, you know, it's just one lineage changing through time. So
Yeah.
that's what it's called, anagenesis, and that is what results from the mechanism that Darwin and Wallace proposed.
Yeah.
To get cladogenesis, which is the splitting of populations to form separate species, requires additional theories. And there's several additional theories which were proposed. So there's parapatric speciation, where there's adjacent populations in two different types of forests, say, and they evolve in the different types of forests to become two separate species. And in fact, Wallace proposed a mathematical mechanism model for that mode of speciation, which is now called the Wallace effect, or the more common modern name for it is anyway, I can't remember, but anyway, it's called, you look up the Wallace effect.
Yeah.
And then there's sympatric speciation, where species arise in different niches within the same habitat. And that was Darwin's speciation mechanism. He believed that that's how speciation occurred. And basically, biologists and others have shown that if it occurs in nature, it's exceptionally rare, and that the main modes of speciation are the parapatric speciation that I mentioned, or allopatric, which is probably the commonest, where species arise separately in different areas, separated by a mountain range, or if a population gets to an island like the Galapagos Islands, it can diverge from the ancestral population, etc. So the allopatric and parapatric models are what Wallace believed in, and he turns out to be right, as usual.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question I wanted to ask you, and I'm only asking this because I believe this is the narrative out there. And I don't think it's the right narrative, but I'll put it to you so you can clarify to the viewers. The way Wallace has been painted in certain quarters is as someone who wasn't exactly a purely rational scientist. They try and show him as being a little bit unhinged. So, for example, when he was involved in some practices which they deem as occultist or spiritualist, then they use these examples to discredit him as a scientist and the work that he did, which was based on the same naturalism which all scientists were involved in, like Darwin, but using those things that he may have been involved in near the end of his life to paint him as a person. That's the sort of narrative that I got when I was reading about him many years ago. Would you say that there's a deliberate attempt to
Yes.
make
Yeah.
him anti-rationalist?
Yeah. Many of these things are deliberate attempts. I know, because I have sort of insider knowledge of some of the historians of science who have written these sort of things. And certainly spiritualism wasn't a big issue during Wallace's lifetime. In fact, it was basically a field which was open to scientific sort of study. And once, when Darwin actually very kindly managed to get a government pension for Wallace, who was sort of not doing very well financially. And Hooker, when he wrote to Hooker for support, Hooker said, "Oh, well, what about Wallace's spiritualism?" Hooker was the only person that I know of who kicked up any sort of fuss. But then Darwin wrote to Huxley and said, "Oh, Hooker says so and so. What shall we do?" And Huxley wrote back saying, "Well, basically, Wallace's beliefs are no different to the beliefs of the majority of the country, i.e., meaning Christianity. It was all, basically religion to him." And then, so anyway, Darwin then got the support of Hooker. Wallace then wrote a very important book called Island Life, which he dedicated to Hooker, not knowing that there was this incident. And Hooker then became all very, very friendly. But after Wallace's death, certainly there's been this thing about sort of trying to blacken his name by saying, "Oh, he was a spiritualist," etc. But the interesting thing, which is a fact, is that when Darwin discovered natural selection in 1838, after he came back from the Beagle voyage, he was actually a Christian at that point. He hadn't lost his Christianity.
Yes.
And Wallace, when he discovered natural selection in 1858, he was actually an atheist at that point. We know that for sure. So he said, all there is matter and force, and that's all he believed in. And he rejected the idea of a soul, etc. So you've got this strange case of actually a Christian and an atheist discovering the same theory. Darwin lost his faith in Christianity, but he never became an atheist. All the Darwin experts say that he was still a deist when he died.
Yeah.
But Wallace gradually became a spiritualist after getting back to England in 1862. Towards the end of around just before the 1870s, his sister became interested in spiritualism, and apparently Wallace says some strange, inexplicable things happened to the household of a friend, and he started to go to seances, and it was all the rage at the time. Lots of other scientists were going to these seances and being amazed by what they saw. And Wallace was probably a bit gullible, although he tried to be a good scientist to make sure there were no trapdoors and whatever. He was clearly, being fooled, although some of the things he described are really difficult to explain. And I believe his account, because he was always a very good observer of everything. So, for instance, there was one account where he was in a room of a good friend of his, and the friend had this huge round table which wobbled if anyone put their hand on it. And all the people at the seance were arranged around the table. And there was the medium called Miss Guppy, who was an extremely overweight lady. And she was sitting on the table. They all put their hands on the table. The lights momentarily went out. And lo and behold, the table hadn't moved during that time. When the lights went on, Miss Guppy was in the middle of the table on her chair. How you explain that? I mean, she wasn't agile enough to have clambered up on the table. And it was the room of a friend. So how could there be elaborate wires and things? So those sort of things, I mean, it was probably a trick, but don't know how it was done. And Wallace was astounded, and he went to several seances and slowly became more and more interested in this. And his worldview kind of altered. He still was a very good scientist, still did very good scientific work, and believed till his death in the primacy of natural selection. But he came to develop the strange theory or idea, which I don't think anyone else has ever had. Maybe there's some people that do, but he believed that the spirit world was part of the natural world. So there was the world of life and the world of spirit, and the two could intercommunicate. And by science, you could study the spirit world. And that there was no God. There was just these spirits. I don't know. I don't understand it. And it's not my speciality, so I've never gone into it in great detail. But yeah.
What I would say to that, and thank you for that history, is when we look at the supporters of Darwin at the time, like Asa Gray, a practicing Christian. No one is going to discount his contributions to Darwinism or to natural selection because he's a Christian. Or today we have Francis Collins, who's been a really important force in terms of genomics, and he's a Christian. So nobody takes the personal beliefs of a particular scientist and then tries to downplay their contributions. Yet with Wallace, we find that, because one thing I found interesting, and this is somebody who, I really do respect Wallace, and I think he's been done over, is that his scientific methodology did not change. He didn't say, okay, something can't be explained, therefore God. He didn't say something can't be explained, therefore spirit. He took the scientific method and said, okay, well, maybe we can apply it to these things. And he never actually, I believe, misused his position as a credible scientist to try and push out his own beliefs on others. So I think a lot of these things are non sequiturs. Whatever he believed personally in his life should have no impact on his legacy. But I think many years ago when I started looking at this, one of the first things you come across Wallace is that. So before you can get into his ideas, before you can look into his credibility, he was working class, Darwin was not, and Darwin took care of him, and he was just somebody that tagged along, and then he became a spiritualist, and he just went into the footnotes of history. So it's a really great contribution to the history of science what you're doing, George, because I think for a lot of people, a lot of this will be paradigm shifting for them, because all their life they've been hearing Darwin, 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 and now we have very good evidence that actually is Darwin and Wallace on the on the minimum it should be 50-50. And in some contexts, I would say, like I said to you previously, he contributed more to the modern synthesis than Darwin did.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's not just my work, so don't just take it from me, but Jim Costa, who's an extremely good scientist, who is an expert on Darwin as well, and has written things like a book called The Annotated Origin of Species. He's an expert on Darwin. And Charles Smith, who's a meticulously careful guy, incredibly knowledgeable, probably the only person in the world who's read every single thing Wallace ever wrote, which was about 1,000 articles and 22 books. I totally agree with you. Religion shouldn't influence the scientific legacy of someone like Wallace. It's a separate issue. There's, as I point out on my website, the Wallace Memorial Fund, science is being done by hundreds of thousands of religious people all over the world every single day. So they might not apply the scientific method to their philosophy of life, but they do in their workplace. And science and religion, are not, you shouldn't sort of, for instance, Fisher, who Dawkins says was the greatest Darwinist since in the 20th century, who came up with, sort of modern population genetics. He was a Roman Catholic and was pretty devout.
Mendel.
Yeah, Mendel, exactly. So, it's just kind of dishonest to try and blacken somebody like Wallace's name by bringing in spiritualism. Spiritualism, in my view, is no different or worse to Christianity. They're both, belief systems in the end, and then not to do with science, which is basically an agnostic endeavor.
Yeah.
And I just have to add, I've been thinking about this because of this interview, which I haven't really thought of before, and I realize what my interpretation of it now is that there's sort of agnosticism in the middle, sort of belief in gods to one side, and then basically atheism on the other side, because atheism is as much as a belief system as religion, whereas science is agnostic and doesn't take sides. it will only accept things where there's actually, hard evidence, but you can't disprove anything basically by science. So you
Yeah,
can't disprove God. So atheism is not a scientific belief system.
yeah. And most importantly, we have to look at the contributions of a person and what they bring to the table in terms of their work, and everything else we can, leave aside. There's some more questions I had, but because we're running out of time, I think I'm going to ask, I think, the most important one. Um, Wallace has strong views on biogeography, particularly his work on the Wallace line. What is biogeography, and how did his understanding of species distribution shape his contributions to the theory of natural selection?
Okay, that's a good question. Yeah, Wallace is actually the regarded as the father of evolutionary biogeography. So the biogeography pre-Wallace was the kind that Humboldt came up with, etc. They These people weren't evolutionists. So evolutionary biogeography actually informs information about how evolution has taken place, and it gives evidence for evolution. And um, it's the distribution of animals in space. So whereas paleontology is the distribution in time, biogeography is the distribution in space of animal species and populations. And what Wallace basically observed is that the closer species are spatially, uh, often the more closely related they are. So you tend to get um, whole groups of animals being found in the same zoological region or region of the world. So you get, for instance, hummingbirds only in the Americas, but sunbirds, which are their equivalents in the old world, are found in Africa and Asia. And so the sunbird species are kind of grouped together in space, as are the hummingbird species. And studies of the distribution of animals can tell you a lot about evolution. And Wallace published two thick books called The Geographical Distribution of Animals, which founded the whole subject, and then a book called Island Life, which focused on island biogeography. And he made lots and lots of major discoveries in that field. And biogeographers are very proud of Wallace. They're the one group of scientists that really love Wallace. There's even an annual Wallace Award by the Biogeographical Society.
Yeah. And this is obviously an area which Darwin didn't really step in,
No,
had very little
yeah.
impact in. That's brilliant, George. Thank you for giving me your time. I know you have a big tour coming up. So, what words can you leave us with to inspire people to look into Wallace's legacy?
I think the best thing is to please read Jim Costa's book, Radical by Nature. It's very accessible and easily obtainable, and it will give you a very good overview of Wallace's very amazing and rich life.
Hmm. Brilliant. Thank you for your time, George. It was lovely speaking to you. Until next time, cheers.
Cheers.